Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the ISAS webinar titled India and Japan, Two Asian Powers in a Changing Geopolitical Context. To discuss the topic today, we are delighted to have with us Professor Stephen R. Nagy, Department of Politics and International Studies, International Christian University, Tokyo, Japan. And this webinar will be moderated by Dr. Sandeep Bharadwaj, Visiting Research Fellow. Today's webinar will be live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page. I shall now invite Dr. Sandeep to commence the webinar. Dr. Sandeep, please.
Thank you, Raghav. It seems like we are having a little bit of connectivity issue at ISAS office. So please bear with us if you have a little bit of problem in hearing us. Hopefully, there won't be any problem in hearing Professor Nagy, which is what we are here for. Nevertheless, hello everyone and welcome and thank you for joining. This is the third edition of our new webinar series, India and Asia. This series aims to unpack India's changing position as a rising power in Asia. In particular, ask what kind of roles India can play in the region and how do various countries in the region view India and India's rise. We kicked off this series in August with discussion on Maldives-India relations. In September, we discussed Philippines-India relations. And today, we are discussing Japan-India relations. It is a relationship that is often ignored, but I think extremely important. These are two giants, and the way they interact with each other just doesn't have bearing on themselves, but also on the region as a whole. I think it was also revealing that Japan was the first country that Prime Minister Modi visited after the American tariffs came into effect in August this year. Unfortunately, that news was buried under later Modi's visits to meet President Xi and President Vladimir Putin. But it is revealing, and it was an important signal that how New Delhi prioritizes its relationships within the region. India and Japan cooperate very closely on economy because they view their economies essentially as complementary. Japan has been historically one of the biggest suppliers of ODA to India, and in recent years, it has been one of the greatest sources of technology and investments. And they have also been moving close geostrategically because of a shared vision of regional order and their common concerns about China's rise. But at the same time, it is also important to remember that there are challenges in the relationship, and I wonder the potential challenges in the relationship, and I wonder how these strong fundamentals that exist would interact with those challenges as they seem to be emerging. One possible challenge may be that Japan has now a new prime minister, Sanae Takaichi, who is likely to take a hardline approach to China. It is anticipated. Then this is at a time when India is trying to thaw its relationship with China and take a more balanced approach. How does that square with how Tokyo will now approach its foreign policy? At the same time, US-India relationship are fraying, and there is a possibility that even if there is a trade deal, as had been promised over and over again, even it is very unlikely that the two sides will go back to the easy strategic partnership that existed before after this crisis. So in that situation, how does Japan position itself, given that it is a treaty ally to US and very deeply embedded in the American security architecture in the region? And if there's a pullback on Indian side from that whole alliance system, then how does that play out? And also Tokyo and New Delhi have had some differences on some key non-China issues, Russia, and in the past nuclear issues. How will those factors affect the relationship going forward? So to understand this very interesting and dynamic relationship and how it fits into the larger changing Indo-Pacific order, we have with us Professor Stephen R. Nagy. Raghav already introduced him. He's the professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University of Tokyo. And he's a prolific commentator on strategic issues. I'm sure many of you may have already heard him at some forum or read his writings. He writes a very insightful column in the Japan Times, which I learned a lot from. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Nagy, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Sandeep, and thank you very much to the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. It's a real pleasure to be back talking to you virtually, and it's a real pleasure to talk about Japan-India relations. And I think it's such a fantastic opportunity and time. We've just seen Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi in APEC potentially signing a trade deal. We saw Mr. Trump visit ASEAN. We saw Mr. Trump strengthen his relations with Japan during his visit. And it's within that kind of context that I'd like to talk about Japan-India relations. And I'd like to add another layer. Back in, I think it was May or June, President Trump put tariffs on India. And I was quite struck actually with the commentary in India talking about the end of the US India relationship, talking about how President Trump put back the relationship 20 and 30 and 40 years. And as I was talking with colleagues, and I thought, this rhetoric and all the noise didn't reflect the underlying dynamics between India and the United States. But I think importantly, it presented a really interesting opportunity to talk about how Japan and India are critical partners in anchoring the United States into the region and why their interests are directly linked to, I think, the US interests within the region. And with that, I was thinking about, my colleague and I were in a paper that we were putting together, really was thinking about, so where is Japan and India in terms of cooperation? How can they cooperate, not only to benefit themselves, as they've been doing for the past 25, 30 years, but how can they use that cooperative structure to keep the United States within the region, whether it's Trump or Biden or Santa Claus. It doesn't matter from the standpoint of India or Japan. The United States is a needed partner. And with that, we came up with this idea that, rather than this idea of, multiple alignment, we kind of came up with this idea that, Japan and India are both interested in creating a multipolar Indo-Pacific. So through this multipolar construction, we think there's a strategy of building overlapping centers of authority to prevent a single power from emerging, a single hegemonic power from emerging. So we believe, or we came to the conclusion as Japan and India are cooperating, that they see this broader Indo-Pacific region through the lens of multipolarity. And they see the lens of pulling the center of gravity, in particular economic gravity, away from a China-centered production network to one that's broadly distributed in the Indo-Pacific region. India as a huge pull. ASEAN countries through ASEAN as a huge pull. Japan working with South Korea, Australia, New Zealand as a pull. Even the European as a whole through trade agreements, and then lastly, keeping the United States in the region as a whole. And as we were thinking about how this works and how Japan and India are cooperating, we kind of identified 4 different areas. The first one is institutional layering, and I'm going to come back to that. The second one is normative competition. Third is capability distribution. And 4 is strategic diversification. So if we think about institutional layering between Japan and India within this broader Indo-Pacific region, the multipolar region, we came to this view that India and Japan are trying to find ways to build layered institutions within the region, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are part of the same institution. In this sense, we have Japan that bases its Indo-Pacific engagement through the U.S.-Japan alliance. That's not changing. We saw that on full view in Tokyo just this week with President Trump visiting the Japan, talking about rare earth cooperation, talking about military cooperation, talking about many different layers of cooperation. That is the foundation for Japan. But then Japan works with India through the quadrilateral security framework or dialogue. And this dialogue has shifted away from a security focus to one that is broadly focused on public good provisions. So here again is another layer, building an institution in which India and Japan are also working with Australia and the United States to build more public goods within the region. This includes infrastructure and connectivity. There's technology sides, but there's also a security side. But from India's point of view, and again, this is where we see Japan and India slightly diverge. India wants to focus on the Indian Ocean because that's where it feels it has its most interests, and Japan wants to focus on the broader Indo-Pacific. So we don't have to be aligned on everything, but this institutional layering is becoming more apparent. We have infrastructure and connectivity agreements between Japan, Australia, and New Zealand as another example of institutional layering. And then we have institutional layering through potential trade agreements and other kinds of institutional layering. On normative competition, of course, here Japan and India are working, as you mentioned, Sandeep, in trying to create this idea of a rules-based order within the Indo-Pacific region, but globally. And I think the firm view is that a rules-based order based on international law is critical to these two middle powers negotiating a great power competition between the United States and China. And I'm going to come back to that because I think calling India a middle power is somewhat controversial, and calling Japan a middle power is controversial in some quarters. But I want to come back to that and say, yeah, they are middle powers, and this is not a demeaning point. It's a reflective of their comprehensive power compared to China and the United States. And of course, one day India will be a great power, but today, comprehensively, it's not. So the normative competition here, and what we're thinking about, is what kind of order we want. And we see China, in particular, putting out different kinds of frameworks. It has the Global Civilization Initiative. It has the Global Development Initiative. It has the Global Security Initiative. It has the Belt Road Initiative. It also has the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. These are all challenges to the existing order, trying to put out Chinese understandings of how order should be. And these are largely based on its 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, in particular, prioritization of sovereignty, prioritization of non-interference, so-called non-aggression, mutual benefit, etc. So this is the competition that we're putting out there, right? Non-binding kinds of agreements through the BRI that are meant to preserve sovereignty. But when we see India and Japan negotiate this normative competition, again, they're thinking about a rules-based order, a rules-based order, a rule of law-based international order in which commonly understood rules are developed and made amongst the family of nations that constrain power. And here's where the normative competition happens, is that Japan and India at this stage in their development are willing to curb their power if it means constraining the power of great powers, where China again feels very uncomfortable with this. Same with Russia, and we've seen this with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has a different concept of security. And then lastly, and this is the joker card that's come into the international order, is the United States under the President Trump has, challenged a normative competition by not following international law in some areas. So we have institutional layering between the United States, between Japan and India, in trying to create an international order based on rule of law and in a multipolar region. It has normative competition. And then we have capability distribution. In this sense, when I'm talking about capability distribution, I'm from Canada, Canadians like peanut butter. I don't know how many of your audience people like peanut butter, but we have a saying, if you spread the peanut butter too thin, you don't taste anything. And in the context of capability distribution and India and Japan relations, I think that both countries are working towards distributing their capabilities and their resources in a way that reflect sub-regional challenges rather than dealing with the entire Indo-Pacific. So India, again, should concentrate its resources in its maritime domain, in dealing with terrorism and challenges in the subcontinent, in infrastructure and connectivity development with the Middle East. This makes sense considering its capabilities rather than stretching its capabilities into Northeast Asia and the Sea of Japan and perhaps the Pacific Islands. Where Japan being more centered in the Pacific side of the Indo-Pacific, it makes more sense that its capabilities are primarily focused on the Sea of Japan, the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea. So capability distribution is going to be really important in how they create and craft an Indo-Pacific region that is broadly multipolar, but selective in its alignment. So there's still multiple alignment, but it's rather selective. Capability distribution could be things like maritime domain awareness. It could be anti-piracy operations. It could be things like illegal, unregulated, undocumented fishing cooperation. Could be things like sanctions evasions, as we're thinking about North Korea and weapons of mass destruction proliferation. And then in the Indian context, we're thinking about, well, how can they deal with terrorism in the subcontinent? How can they deal with the challenges of an unstable Pakistan and the challenges that India has faced over the past year with Pakistan? And how do we deal with a growing influence of China through the BRI in different countries within the region? So we can add value to each other, and that's what the Japanese and Indians are doing. But at the same time, I think they're really finding that they have to distribute their capabilities to understand and maximize the effect of their limited capabilities in their backyards. And this is where they start to form alignments with different countries. So India is better situated to cooperate with the Middle Eastern countries and likely Southeast Asian countries. Geographically, that's their historic roots. They've cooperated over centuries through these partnerships. And to deal with the challenges in India's backyard makes more sense to cooperate with these countries than reaching out to distant countries, whether it's Canada, where I'm from, or otherwise. That doesn't mean they don't have a role, but capability distribution will be related to the geographic partners that are in the region. Same with Japan. Working, for example, in the Maldives or in Pakistan, of course, is important to a certain extent, but their priority sub-regional areas are obviously Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and I think the Pacific Islands. Capability distribution between Japan and India is going to continue to be an interesting area, and where they converge will be interesting areas of alignment. Lastly, strategic diversification. As we think about India and Japan, we're thinking about how they can strategically diversify, again, with that end goal of pulling the center of gravity of the Indo-Pacific away from China towards the broader distribution of supply chains, trade, economic integration, technology integration, etc. So strategic diversification does not mean decoupling from China. And I want to be very clear with that. I think there's a lot of rhetoric out there when we talk about China, about decoupling from this market. And let's be frank, this is very difficult. Japan's second biggest trading partner is China. It still has a huge manufacturing footprint in China, and now it's changed its model, producing things in China, for China, by Chinese, but with Japanese technologies. And we're seeing the migration away from a China-centered production network to Southeast Asia and India. And this is where this alignment comes in. India is the biggest recipient of overseas direct assistance from Japan for 20 years. And it's going to be the biggest recipient for another 20 years. There's huge alignment here. And again, as Sandeep and Raghuwa mentioned, they have complementary economies. Japan has the technology, it has the capital, but it doesn't have the people. India has the people. It has sometimes the technology and sometimes the capital, but not the same amount. So we have some complementariness in here. And there's lots of examples of this. So, for example, the Mumbai-Kolkata corridor, which is an infrastructure plan that the Japanese invested in, was meant to connect the east and west parts of India. So there's more, it can function more effectively as an economy. We see great investments in northeast of Delhi in terms of making a manufacturing platform. And that's the bilateral level. But we also see, again, minilateral cooperation with India, with Japan working with Australia and the United States through the Quad to engage in technology transfers, to engage in, during the pandemic, vaccine production, etc. Of course, not all of these work 100%. Some of them don't work at all, but some of them move forward. And again, we can critique the minilateral or bilateral cooperation and the problems with it. But at the same time, I think we should be clear that, any progress is progress. So strategic diversification also means strategic diversification in terms of where we get energy resources, where we get military arms. And again, this is really important as we think about India's predicament in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's unreasonable for supporters of Ukraine to expect India to quickly diversify away from Russia in terms of energy and arms. These are important in dealing with its economy, but also dealing with its security challenges within the region. So here we see strategic diversification where India, is working with Quad partners, working with Japan to find alternative weapons or military weapons to, again, slowly, selectively diversify away from Russia. But I want to be very clear, that doesn't mean decouple from Russia in terms of some diplomatic areas. The reality is that India has long-standing relations with the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and there are, some strong connections today even with Russia, which makes complete decoupling away from Russia really unlikely. The same with Japan. Japan, does have cooperation still with Russia today in terms of seafood, in terms of trying to preserve the resources it invested in Sakhalin Islands. So strategic diversification is something that they work together on in the economic area, in the military munitions area, but also, again, finding new alternatives in terms of energy to help keep the Indian economy going. And Japan has lots of experience in developing and diversifying its own energy profile away from a Middle East focused approach. So again, these are strategic diversification areas of cooperation. Now, again, some key ideas that I think we can think about when we look at Japan-China relations or Japan-India relations. One is, again, these are realist insights that both countries are balancing hard and soft power. So, they're balancing China's size by acquiring military power together and finding bilateral and minilateral ways to cooperate in terms of technology and military arms. But in the soft areas, we see institutional cooperation, as I meant, institutional layering, and we're going to see more of that. I was a bit surprised not to see India and discussions about India at APEC in terms of where India fits and how can we cultivate a role for India. After all, APEC was founded in 1989 when India was not on the economic map. But today, India is number 4 or 5, and it will be the third largest economy in the next 5 or 10 years. So soft strategies to cooperate include those institutions, and then we're going to see more of that. Trade agreements. We're going to see inclusion of India in probably APEC in the future, and we've seen India's inclusion as a observer at G7. Again, these are the soft strategies that Japan is doing to, again, create that multipolar region and strengthen the relations with India. And India sees this as well. We also see, again, economic balancing, creating different kinds of economic institutions. I do want to introduce this idea of multipolar construction and creating a multipolar region, but this selective multi-alignment strategy. I don't believe in the multi-alignment all the time. I actually see quasi-multi-alignment. The reality is that for India to deal with the challenges in its region, it must have the strong relationship with the United States. And in this sense, I think that one of the better ways to do it is to form a strong partnership with Japan and become an indispensable partner with the United States by working with Japan. So again, it's a multipolar construction that we're seeing in the Indo-Pacific region, but we also see a kind of quasi-multiple alignment. And scholars like Ashley Telly in his Foreign Affairs article this summer, I think he was quite articulate about this. Again, China's power is much bigger than in India, and I don't think India will be able to catch up for many reasons. And as a result, to deal with the challenge of China, but also the opportunities of China, it must have a strong partner. And in this sense, Japan and India can work collectively there together. Leadership matters, and I think in India's context, there's continuity with Prime Minister Modi, and there's new leadership in Tokyo with Takaichi. I believe that she has a lot of ideological as well as strategic continuity with the late Prime Minister Abe Shinzo in terms of thinking about the Indo-Pacific. And her appointment as National Security Advisor, Ishikawa Ken, who is seen as kind of the brain during the Abe administration behind the Full Whip initiative, signals that she's going to have continuity in her free and open Indo-Pacific vision. Where she might differ, of course, is that she's a new leader, new times, and there's new unpredictability associated with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, which wasn't there during the Abe years. With Mr. Trump, I think fundamentally changing how we think about international trade and international order through transactional diplomacy, but in general through, I think, a commitment to fundamentally changing the US's industrial model that focuses on competition with China, but with strong partners. That includes Japan, and I think we'll include India once we get over this tariff spat. I want to re-emphasize that I think economic interdependence with China is a reality, but it doesn't prevent selective decoupling or selective diversification from China, and we're seeing that already. Dual-use technology, moving critical technologies towards India or Southeast Asia or other countries. And I think that this will continue to be the case moving forward. Now, I don't want to give too much detail, but I wanted to make sure we go back to that idea of middle powers. I look at middle powers and how they are balancing the US-China relationship. And I do realize my Japanese friends and Indian friends will say, oh, you're just a Western colonialist saying these kinds of things about India or Japan. I want to give some data to put this in context. And I think the data will help us understand why Japan and India must cooperate. And they must cooperate on those core areas that I said: institutional layering, normative competition, etc. But they must do this with the United States in order to achieve their long-term interests of moving the center of gravity of the Indo-Pacific away from China towards a more distributed region to maximize strategic autonomy. So let's take a look at some data. The Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index is really good. I hope your viewers do use it. It's a real service that they put together. The overall score for China in 2023 and 2024 was 72.7. So this was behind the United States. But India and Japan, respectively, was 39.1 and 38.9. So there's a gap, a huge gap. Even if Japan and India are combined, their ability to balance China without the partnership between Japan and India, but also with the United States and other partners, really is handicapped. And in that sense, there's a real underlying structural issue that's pushing them together. And I really want to emphasize that. And even if we look at China's own Comprehensive Power Index, so this Comprehensive National Power Index, China puts itself at parity with the United States, whether that's true or not, but they put Japan and India well back. And then lastly, if we look at other power indexes, again, we see Pareto's power index that comes out of Finland also puts India and Japan very far back. So as we think about their ability to balance US-China relations and again work together, we see that any vision of building a multipolar region that has quasi-multi-alignment that pulls the center of gravity of China's power away from China towards these hubs which have maximum strategic autonomy must include the United States. And I think that this is an uncomfortable reality in the wake of Trump's tariffs in many countries, but I think it's something that is reflected in the structural power dynamics within the region. So again, as India and Japan think about their own cooperation, I'm going to probably end it here. Let me just re-emphasize that these two countries are converging because of the US-China competition, but they also have underlying values and historical relationship that's not defined by conflict or imperialism. at least imperialism towards India by Japan. They also have some strong cultural dynamics and roots. And, this was illustrated when Prime Minister Abe brought Prime Minister Modi to Kyoto. He took him to a temple called Sanju Gendo, and Sanju Gendo is the longest wooden temple, and it's filled with Buddhist priests or statues that look like Indians. They don't look like ethnic Chinese people. And the names are all in Sanskrit. And again, this was a strong message that Abe was delivering to Modi, that Japan has a cultural inheritance from India that dates back centuries. It's not just about their post-World War II position on Japan's wartime behavior. And again, we also have complementariness in their economy. So as Japan and India are working together, I guess some key take-homes for your audience is that they're engaged in institutional layering to strengthen their relationship, not only in security, but in trade, technology. Future, it's going to be AI. We're likely to see some institutional layering in migration and educational exchanges as well. And that is very much illustrated in Prime Minister Modi's visit to Japan in August, which really was incredibly successful in terms of the concrete deliverables that both countries were engaged in. It wasn't just icing on the cake. I mentioned normative competition, and again, these two countries working together to build a multipolar region. They want a rules-based order based on international law. I mentioned capability distribution based on sub-regional approaches to looking at the Indo-Pacific region. And then I finished with strategic diversification, which I think that these two countries are engaged in strategic diversification, not away from each other, but again, thinking about how they can diversify some of their dependencies on China, lessen the challenges associated with economic coercion, but at the same time, and I want to re-emphasize this, that China is an important and will always be an important part of the region economically, and that these two countries, if they want to prosper and move forward, that they have to have a relationship with China that is characterized broadly by deep engagement, but deep resilience against economic coercion, and also, I think, strong investments in deterrence. And deterrence is, of course, a strong focus on military or defense deterrence, without, I think, an offensive side to their cooperation. So I'll stop there, Sandeep. Hopefully that this gives you some ideas for today's discussion. And I really, again, thank you for the opportunity for engaging today.
Steven, thank you. That was very interesting and very insightful. And one of the markers of how insightful it was that when we had that technical interruption, I was watching the numbers and nobody dropped out of the call. I was expecting at least a couple of people get frustrated and leave, but nobody left because it seemed like you had everybody's attention. So the floor is now open. You can ask your questions. You can put it in the chat box, and in the question, I'm sure you have the question function, and then we'll just clear them one after another. In the meantime, let me just start with one question that I had about, especially about the capability distribution and the way you're thinking about prioritizing, geographically thinking about it. It reminded me a lot about the Anglo-Japanese alliance that existed at the beginning of the 20th century, which was in many ways also about just basically British India and Japan, and thinking about how the two together can have some sort of. But correct me if I'm wrong, but you're not thinking in terms of sphere of influences here. You are not thinking in those terms, but you are thinking in more cooperative terms. And so just as a follow-up to that, also about the fact that for this kind of capability distribution, some sort of understood division of labor between the two powers, won't you think that that would require an enormous degree of trust on both sides? Which I suppose, even with the good relationship that the two sides have, that requires an ally level of trust, of that level of understanding on both sides, to have some degree of comfort of doing this kind of geopolitical division of labor. What do you think about that? Yeah.
So the first part, I don't think Japan or India are pursuing spheres of influence in the same way as I think Russia thinks about the concept of spheres of influence, or even China thinking about spheres of influence. Both countries have learned different things from their experience with imperialism and colonialism. In Japan's case, it's about development, building strong relations based on trust, investment, and being strongly wedded to defense-only kinds of cooperation. And that's rooted deeply in its pacifist constitution, which I don't think will fundamentally change even under Takaichi if she decides, if they're successful in revising the constitution. India as well, it was colonized by Britain for 300 or 400 years, a long time. From their point of view, spheres of influence is reminiscent of the imperial period and colonialism, and I think it's something that, pardon the expression, is against their DNA in many ways, right? Their historical learning is that, they had many issues associated with colonialism. So I don't think when I say capability distribution, I'm talking about spheres of influence. I'm saying where they can deliver the most resources to get the biggest bang for their buck. So again, in India's case, distributing its naval resources to the Sea of Japan, or let's say the Gulf, in today's India, I think is a waste of resources. They don't have the resources. It's better to concentrate those resources in the Indian Ocean, where India faces the biggest challenges to its interests, whether it's piracy or illegal, unregulated, undocumented, and unregulated fishing, or others, or a growing PLA presence, which is, from India's standpoint, unnerving. Japan as well, sending its naval forces to the East Africa or Western Indian Ocean without very, very good reason it doesn't make much sense. So here, what I'm talking about in terms of capability distribution is a clear identification of subregions and working with other countries, not just India, Japan, but in various minilateral formulas to secure different subregions of the Indo-Pacific. And let me give you an example that doesn't include India or Japan, but I think it's a place where they may potentially have some opportunity to cooperate, is in the South China Sea with dark vessel technology provision. Now here, unusually, but as a Canadian, I'm quite proud of this, the Canadians have taken the lead. And they're working with the Philippines to provide dark vessel technology to deal with illegal, unregulated, and undocumented fishing by China. Particularly China, but there's other countries as well. So can Japan plug in on this? Can India plug in on this? What is the formula for cooperation in that space? I think they have a lot that they can offer, but it's not necessarily capacity and the number of ships, but experience. So this may be an example. I think that Japan can offer that security in the South China Sea, and this will contribute to India's look east or act east policy. So I think, again, it's not about spheres of influence. It's about, okay, we are limited capabilities and capacities. Let's focus on what we can. Maybe we can have some force multipliers by creating certain kinds of formulas of minilateral cooperation. But we have to be realistic that we can't be everywhere all the time. Once you do that, you're nowhere anytime. And I think that's a really important point. The second point you mentioned, Sandeep, was about trust. And again, I'm not talking about hard security issues. I'm talking about more soft security cooperation, which I think requires a different level of trust. But even so, India and Japan don't have any, I think, competing security interests. Actually, more of their interests overlap. The question is how much they overlap. So I think on the East Indian Ocean, Japan shares concerns about a growing PLA presence and the presence of Chinese built ports in that region. So how much can Japan cooperate with India in that space and ensuring that those ports are used for commercial purposes? That is, again, goes back to maritime domain awareness and some specific areas of cooperation. And I think this will continue to be the case as they find those cooperative areas. And it's not about Japan defending India or India defending Japan in a formal alliance. It's more about areas of cooperation.
Let me just little bit abuse my power as a moderator and just tack on a follow-up on that. I just wonder, what do you think is Japan's take on India's expansion of its hard military presence in naval military presence in the South China Sea and Malacca Straits, right? For example, Philippines has now been trying to pull India a little bit more for its
Yep.
naval presence in South China Sea. India has expressed interest in trying to participate in the Malacca Straits patrol. So in those kind of historically Japanese sensitive areas, is the Indian presence welcome, or is it there is a degree of wariness in there? How is it perceived?
I think the Japanese look at India with huge potential, and they want to deepen this relationship. And let me give you an anecdotal experience. I attended the 75th anniversary of the Republic of India at an event in Tokyo. There were 3 former prime ministers that came to the event. 4 the former defense ministers. There was representatives from 3 or 4 political parties, as well as the current Ministry of Economic Security, the current cabinet secretary. That's the guy that is kind of the gatekeeper for the prime minister. It was an incredible display of Japanese political power and commitment to the India-Japan relationship. And I say that because I think that the Japanese really welcome India's participation within the region. They would welcome its the development of a peaceful defensive industry, military industry that really focuses on issues similar to Japan. It's defense-only approach to security. I think they welcome India having a bigger role in many different parts of security cooperation in the South China Sea and the Malacca Straits. Again, as I mentioned, in the South China Sea, dealing with some of the challenges there. They would welcome India in sanctions evasion exercises and cooperation in the Sea of Japan. So I see very little friction in that. Where the challenge is, and this is the challenge with any kind of international cooperation, is how do you build the institutional ties and the shared human capacity and human capital so that you communicate better and that you add value rather than just complicate the current activities within the region. So that's going to take time, and I think it's going to take more cooperation that, it's something that comes, but it just takes some time. And I think there's some frameworks and already pre-existing examples of where this can come from. And let me just illustrate this. So Japan's been investing in something called reciprocal access agreements. They built one with Australia, and that was the first one. It was kind of like the test case. So where they can put resources in Australia, they do some joint training. There's some rules about if Japanese or Australians commit crimes in each other's countries and what can happen. So this framework then became the model for the UK, Japan reciprocal access agreement, and the Philippines. Japan reciprocal access agreement. So I think this is one model that may be used to expand the cooperation that already exists between Japan and India. Another model is to look at the changing and deepening cooperation between Australia and Japan over the decades. It didn't start. It didn't start where it is today. It was step by step in terms of exchange of security or defense officials, more 2+2 meetings between foreign ministers and defense ministers to build the kinds of shared understanding. So that may be another model. But we also have models like the Camp David principle agreement between South Korea, Japan, and the United States, where they start to think about all the different areas of cooperation, or even the Squad agreement between the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and the United States. There's a lot of different models out there for cooperation, and it's about just slowly and incrementally building the kinds of shared human capital and shared understandings to have smoother cooperation rather than sometimes more cooperation that's not so doesn't add so much value.
That makes sense. So let me just ask a question from my colleague Ivan. He would like to know about India-Japan cooperation in Taiwan issue, especially if there is a crisis of some sort in Taiwan, on Taiwan Straits. Then is there a conceivable way in which India and Japan can cooperate?
So, Ivan, thank you very much for a question. So I think a good place to start why they need to cooperate and why they need to build some shared understandings of cooperation with Taiwan is Taiwan's economic role within the region. You know, it's not only Japan that's providing FDI and overseas development to aid to India. Taiwan's a big player. And, you know, God forbid if there was a Taiwan contingency or even worse, a multiple contingency, this would ruin the Taiwanese economy, but the downstream effects on Southeast Asia and India would also be quite damaging. And in this sense, what happens to Taiwan matters for the entire region and the world. And this is why I think there needs to be better, well, first of all, we need to recognize Taiwan as an international public good or a public good because its place in the global economy means that if something happens to it, has those downstream effects. So we need to invest the diplomatic resources there. Second, and I think importantly, again, its place within sea lines of communication affect Japan and India respectively, which again suggests that we need to coordinate our cooperation on Taiwan. So I think that the challenges of a one China policy make this more difficult. Both India and China and Japan recognize a one China policy based on their interpretations. So how can we create cooperation with Taiwan? And in general, I'm a proponent of what I call non-state cooperation and building consortiums of universities or labor unions or education institutes so we can build some shared understanding about issues. And this allows us to navigate the one China policy in a rather diplomatic and nuanced way. A good example may be disinformation. In here, with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, I've written quite a bit about this, where we form a group of universities that may include South Korea, may include Canada, Taiwan, Japan, US, Australia, and India, and do research on disinformation. This may be a place where we can add value, build those shared strategic understandings of a very sensitive space. At the same time, we're maintaining a very nuanced and approach to how we manage Taiwan. I think there's other areas of cooperation, Ivan. I think that we really have to spend some serious time talking about multiple contingency scenarios and how we deal with this. Bilaterally, minilaterally, and multilaterally. So what would be, again, this goes back to the capability distribution. What would be India's role in the Taiwan contingency? What would be Japan's role? Where do they cooperate? Do they cooperate on protecting submarine cables, which is arguably international public good? And this means that you have interest in the region, or do you cooperate on ensuring that sea lines of communication remain open to energy imports and exports? Again, this is a global public good. It has nothing to do with China or Taiwan. It's a global public good. So we have to be very strategic in how we cooperate and how we think about these things. And I think this is some strategies that we need to be thinking about. Something that's just going to come out, I think, today or tomorrow at the Research Institute for Peace Studies. So maybe your team can link it. But I specifically talk about the challenges of multiple contingency related to Taiwan and the different formulas of cooperation that Japan and India and others need to cooperate on, because this is a very serious issue. And there's a great book that came out by Carlos Masala, and it's called What If Russia Wins? And it paints a scenario in 3 or 4 years where Russia uses a whole bunch of different kinds of distractions to occupy some Russian-speaking towns in the Baltics. And we could see something similar in this region, right? China fomenting instability in Myanmar, distracting India and distracting Southeast Asian countries. maybe distraction on the Korean Peninsula by with promoting North Korea in some way or testing missiles. And then in the South China Sea, gray zone and other kinds of operations. So how do we then manage the Taiwan situation with all these different layers of distraction? So I think it's an important area, Ivan, and again, we need to be more aligned about the challenges we face.
Thanks. And I thought that that framing of underground submarine cable as public good and that then making a collective responsibility of protecting them is an interesting one. And I wonder to what degree has that been pursued by multilateral agencies. Anyway, we have another question, which was invariable, which was bound to come, which is that given the 50% tariffs on India, how do you expect Quad to go on? Or do you expect Quad to go on?
So, Kim, thank you very much for this comment. So I think that we need to be very patient as we engage with the U.S. administration and look for what sticks and what doesn't stick. And what we've seen, I think, over the past since Liberation Day is that tariffs went from 100% to 30% to 15% for certain countries. And I suspect that the 50% tariffs on India will likely decrease quite substantially as they figure out a way for India to get energy resources from a different country or to dramatically decrease its energy resources. And the Trump administration figures out, again, can read India a little bit better. As I mentioned, India is never going to cut off its relations with Russia. It's a key partner in dealing with some of the security challenges. They sit in the same Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They sit part of BRICS. So they can never get rid of Russia in an institutional standpoint or with regards to other parts of the relationship. But they can deleverage in some ways. That selective diversification, I think that's going to happen over time. And it's a matter of time. Will 50% tariffs remain? I don't think so. I think they'll end up around 15 or 10% like other countries. And the Trump administration will secure some kinds of cooperative investments between India and the United States, like it's done with South Korea, like it's done with the EU, like it's done with Qatar, like it's done with Japan. And I think that it will likely be mutually competitive. What can India do? As my paper really focuses on, I think it needs to work with Japan and likely other partners in the Indo-Pacific to become indispensable partners for the United States. And this could be on rare earth mining or processing. It could be on submarine cables. It could be on technology production. It could be on legacy munitions productions and positioning those legacy munitions throughout the region in the case of a multiple contingency. Some creative thinking needs to be done about how to manage these issues. And I think there's lots of great minds in Tokyo and in India to foster that deeper cooperation and develop indispensability so that they can use that indispensability to shape the Trump administration's behavior or whoever's in the White House in 3 years.
Thank you. But just to follow up on that a little bit, because even till 2-3 years ago, we were talking about the fact that Quad is a way for US and Japan to some way pull India into this taking a greater role in maintaining the regional order and bringing it a little bit closer to the alliance system that exists. And now it was interesting that you started, and it's a completely fair characterization that you started with talking about how Japan and India now need to work together to anchor US and keep it in the region, right? Because US to a certain degree its commitment has been questioned to a certain degree, right?
Yes.
And so now we have a situation, but the original questioning or skepticism about India's commitment has not gone away. India still clings to its strategic autonomy, and India still, to a certain degree, and I imagine after this crisis, will be under greater domestic pressure to stay to a degree aloof from the whole system. So then you have in a Quad system where you have one questionable commitment, one more which is clinging to strategic autonomy. Wouldn't it be better to think of it in a different way for Japan than to kind of just hold on to all of this rickety structure, but think about, say, Australia as a more reliable partner? Just a thought experiment, I'm asking.
Yeah. So Sandeep, I'm going to push back because I think the Quad isn't about US and Japan like manipulating the India. I believe that it was about pulling India into leadership position as equals alongside developed states. That's my strong view. To break the narrative, and again, I just wrote something in the Japan Times about Chinese winning the global narratives through discourse power. China says, the West has created all the rules. The West oppresses developing countries. The West wants to keep us down. I don't think that's the case. I think Japan and the United States, in particular Japan, said, no, we got to get India as a shared leader in the Quad. We are all equals in the Quad. And you are, even though India is a developing state, it is a core member of the Quad as equals. And it counters the narrative that United States and Western countries don't want are not sharing global leadership with developing countries. I think that's the purpose. I think that should continue to be the raison d'être for the Quad, to demonstrate that global leadership is not Western countries versus developing countries. Actually, India is a core country in that process. They also want to convince the global South that India, again, is a key partner of these countries. And I think Japan has been consistent with that. Australia has been consistent with that. The Trump administration was initially consistent with this. And, there was a Quad meeting on the same day that he was inaugurated, if you remember. And then the tariff liberation day started. So I think that they're working on their policy, they're refining it, but I think we should look at the Quad as an opportunity for India to have shared leadership with other countries rather than being led by other countries. Should Japan focus on Australia? Australia is a great partner. Let's be frank, it's gone from strength to strength, the relationship, but it started with mistrust. It started with the World War II legacy. And with leadership and foresight, it's moved to the direction. I think the relationship between India and Japan has moved extremely positively over the past 20, 25 years, and it will continue to move that positively. But that'll be dependent on the leadership in both countries. And I think ultimately, Japan getting more people to go to India and learning about the Indian society, and more Indians coming to Japan and learning about Japanese society, which are sometimes fundamentally different. Japan is a very ordered society, very restrained society. India, in my experience, is a little bit different. So they have to learn more about each other so they can develop that complementary, synergistic relationship. But it takes time.
I have a couple of questions in direct messages. Please use the Q&A box for your questions. It just keeps it more systematic. One is about middle powers, about beyond just thinking about middle powers as having a lower power index of some sort than the US and China. How do we think about middle powers? How are they different from, say, great powers?
So I think middle powers in the 1990s actually meant something more than just a comprehensive power index. So we had, Canada, the Scandinavian countries, maybe Australia, South Korea. They had a normative approach to thinking about foreign policy. And they comparatively had much more power at the time. And so they could use that weight to shape and create discourse about human security, human rights, democracy promotion, right to protect. But in the 2020s, 2025, that group of countries that belong to the middle powers at a comprehensive level are very diverse. So, Iran is a middle power. Turkey is a middle power. Nigeria is a middle power. India is a middle power. South Korea, Canada, Japan, Germany are all middle powers. So it really doesn't say much about what their diplomacy means, what kind of states they are, because we have theocracies, autocracies, soft authoritarian states, highly liberal states like Canada. Doesn't say anything. So then that leads us to the next question. Then what is a middle power? How should they behave? And then I think here is where we start to think about the kinds of diplomacy they engage in. And I think the normative approach of promoting human rights or human security is probably gone. They probably have to be more regionally focused. They have to focus on sustained, meaningful diplomacy. They have to focus on mini-lateral cooperation to, again, find solutions to deal with the regional problems. They have to be much less ideological. And what that means is they're going to have to cooperate with all kinds of political states, not just democracies. And I think that they're going to have to work collectively to sometimes isolate states, sometimes lobby states, sometimes socialize states so that they can achieve their national interests. We've moved into a different period. Again, it's great power politics now, and what we've seen is that middle powers haven't been able to form the kinds of coalitions to improve their power distribution. And we saw this with the tariffs by the United States against many countries. We would predict, like based on the prisoner's dilemma model, that Japan, South Korea, maybe Singapore, Southeast Asian countries would work together to pressure the United States and resist the United States. That didn't happen. Every single country defected and they formed an individual deal with the United States. So I think it'll depend on the area and the leverage that the great power has to cooperate. The counterexample, during prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was some Canadians that were arrested in China, and the Canadians formed a kind of a international coalition to protest against arbitrary political detention of people. So there are some positive examples of the kind of diplomacy that they can engage in, but also some negative examples where they don't engage in. But I think as we think about middle powers, there's not a single political identity. Rather, I think there's a shared set of approaches that they use to try and influence great powers and not be trampled by the elephants playing in the grass.
I think that's a very good way of thinking about it. And also the idea that all the countries defected and made individual deals with United States, because I remember when the Liberation Day started, one of the big conversation in foreign policy circles, especially coming from US, was that this is the collapse of American leadership. Everybody will run away and form just an alternative world. And I know that in your writings, you have pushed back on that idea already in the column you did. And yeah, so that is what happened. That is what ended up happening, that they went back to the well. The other question I have is about India-Japan cooperation in Southeast Asia. To what degree and in what way can the two countries cooperate in Southeast Asia or with Southeast Asia?
Well, fortunately, India and Japan both have long historical relationships with the region, right? I mean, if you go to Myanmar or Thailand or southern Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, it's very difficult not to feel Indian cultural presence. And Japan has had, relations with the region since about the 7th century. They actually had Japan towns in Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam in the 14th and 15th century before they closed up. So these two countries have a lot of historical and cultural relations with these regions. Where they can cooperate, I think we have to think about what are the priorities of Southeast Asia. And the priorities of Southeast Asia continue to revolve around ASEAN and ASEAN as a tool to achieve strategic autonomy from great power politics. The ASEAN way, or consensus decision-based decision-making, something that it cherishes, and India and Japan should continue to cooperate to support this initiative. Development. So infrastructure and connectivity projects. Japan already has invested heavily in east to west corridors, south to north, and a southern corridor where they've tried to build more intra-ASEAN integration. And the idea is that the more trade that ASEAN does with itself means that it's less dependent on great powers, and that means it has more strategic autonomy. And I think if ASEAN has more strategic autonomy, this is good for India and Japanese national interests. So this is where I say the cooperation should go in, focus on ASEAN, focus on the consensus-based decision-making model, focus on cooperation and development in terms of infrastructure and connectivity, and focus on the issues that matter for ASEAN. So piracy, a maritime environment, illegal, unregulated, undocumented fishing. These are all, I think, really areas that India and Japan can cooperate in. They're not sensitive, they're mutually beneficial, and again, I think they very much fit within this broader strategy that I mentioned of building a multipolar Indo-Pacific region that is has quasi-multiple alignment, and again maximizes the strategic autonomy of all the different hubs that I think Japan and India are interested in building.
This has been very interesting. Let me ask a last question before,
Sure.
which is about this idea of pulling the center of gravity of manufacturing network, as you said, away from China and towards Japan, Southeast Asia, India, this whole stretch. And I know that you said specifically that it's not about decoupling from China, but creating some kind of strategic diversification. And it is being done for strategic reasons, clearly. But a move of that sort would involve economic inefficiencies. I mean, building a new factory and creating some kind of environment there and making it competitive compared to what is already functioning in China would cost more, and it will be in certain degree a less profitable venture. That economic inefficiency, if you think about a massive move, not just moving one factory or another, the massive move of that sort would involve a lot of cost. And if we are talking about not bringing those factories back to your own country, but bringing it to a bigger supply chain, which is international, but not to your own country itself, who will pay for that cost? Or how will that cost be distributed? How do you think about that? Because somebody will have to pay for it, right, at some point. So how does that play out, do you think?
So this is a great question, and I would like to address it in terms of a couple different areas. One is, the China-based production network that we see today was not built in a day. It took 40 years. And the world was a very different economy then, and there was very different strategic priorities. It started during the Cold War. Was clearly driven by Cold War dynamics, but also we saw Japan start to deal with the realities of a tightening labor market and unaffordability of its own production network. So we saw these, an alignment of different forces over time to create where we are today. The second point I want to mention is that the production model in China today is extremely efficient, really cheap. But the reality is that the internal market is not growing, and costs are increasing because they also have the same demographic problems that Japan and South Korea, Taiwan experienced in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and today. So there's internal pressure within China to also move to other parts of the region. So as my good friend Carlos Dade of the University of Calgary says, you may want to run away from China, but you're going to run right back into China. We see that in Southeast Asia. There's many Chinese factories, right, that are established there, and because it's cheaper, there's cheaper labor for them as well. So we see the forces of capitalism, forcing even Chinese businesses to diversify away from China. A third level is the policy choices of the government itself in China, and I think, since Xi Jinping came into power, that there's been a strong focus on this so-called idea of shared prosperity, a common destiny for shared prosperity domestically, and more redistributive policies. And Kevin Rudd has really outlined this in his book on Xi Jinping, talking about, more Marxist, Leninist intervention, so more leftist kinds of policies, and at the same time, more nationalist policies, or, that alienate foreign businesses. So domestically, there's many policy choices and changes in China that are also creating the conditions to for production networks to migrate to Southeast Asia, to India, to Central Europe, and eventually to Africa. So as we think about all these different layers, Sandeep, I think that yes, it's going to cost money, but there's already internal drivers that are causing this shift. And as India rises and it has 800 million, people under 30, it's going to have a lot of cheap labor. That's going to be a natural place to migrate industries to. Southeast Asia has limitations because of its population, its geography. So I think the economic forces are going to push it that direction. That being said, the costs of good are going to be with us for 10, 15 years as this transition happens. Inflation is not going away. Whether it was a Harris elected or a Trump elected, whether it was a Hayashi in Japan or Takeichi, whether it's whoever's going to be in power in India or South Korea or Singapore, inflation's with us because of this natural process. And the increased tensions between China and the United States is creating that similar tensions as the Cold War period to recalibrate global economics away from China. But again, they'll still be a critical part, and China plays an incredibly positive force in the global economy at the same time. And I think we should recognize that at the same time as we understand the challenges associated with its reemergence as kind of the central organizing force in the region's economy.
Well, thank you, Stephen. This was a great answer, and generally has been a very fantastic and insightful, engaging presentation. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I hope you got something out of it. We will have the next iteration of India in Asia series in November. We'll be in touch about that. And once again, thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Sandeep. Thanks to the audience, and thanks to Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. Look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.